1972, when reigning world chess champion Boris Spasky of the Soviet Union met American challenger Bobby Fischer in Iceland. In Bobby Fischer Goes to War, BBC journalist John Idenow details the match and its high-stakes geopolitical context. The program's 45 minutes.
I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, who, well, I'll leave it up to your judgment as to which adjectives you would like to apply. The author of the bestseller Wittgenstein's Poker and tonight's book, Bobby Fischer Goes to War, John Idenow.
Well, Michael, thank you for that. And thanks for inviting me to the store to talk about our book. I'm very happy that you read Wittgenstein's Poker in 2 sittings. I only wonder what took you so long. But I'd like to start with Wittgenstein's Poker, as you've mentioned it, and perhaps just say how that came about, and then how we managed to get in from writing about a quarrel, a sharp interchange between 2 leading philosophers, to a chess match between 2 leading chess players. And how did David and I get to write together at all? I used to present programs for the BBC, and in particular for the BBC World Service. And among the programs I presented was one about British politics. It was a regular weekly roundup of British politics called People and Politics. And I presented it over the years, and producers came and went, and I presented the program. And one of the producers who came, I was very happy to say, and sorry when he went, one of the producers who came was David Evans. And we were riding a train down to a seaside resort one summer in the course of doing our program together to one of the British political party conferences. And I did what a lot of BBC people do to make conversation. I talked about something I'd heard on the BBC that morning. And what I'd heard was a news report about the Pope visiting Ghana. And the news report had said that this was the first time a reigning Pope had visited Ghana. And I said to David, in my sub-editor's way, I thought the word reigning was redundant because there was no such thing as a non-reigning Pope. It's an office held until death. And we got into a conversation about this. Around us were these amazed delegates going to their party conference, listening to this conversation about reigning Pope. In the course of that, I learnt that David had studied Wittgenstein at Oxford, where he was. And so later, I won't go into remains that argument, but later I saw some correspondence about the incident at the heart of Wittgenstein's Poker, this very, very sharp, fierce interchange between Ludwig Wittgenstein and Karl Popper, and the question whether Karl Popper had lied in his autobiography about that incident. The book is a detective story. Did he lie? But I saw some correspondence about it in the Times Literary Supplement, a leading British journal, literary journal, weekly. And I cut it out and sent them. I cut out the letters and sent them to David to amuse him. And out of that came our book, Wittgenstein's Poker, which we were very happy, surprised and happy that it had the success it had. So the question then arose of another book. We had got on writing the first one together. It's been enormous fun, very demanding. It was like having a long conversation with somebody over 2.5 years that we wrote the book. This long conversation had gone on extremely enjoyably. And we had written Wittgenstein's Poker. So what next? And David was, who still works for the BBC, was doing a series on the World Chess Championship. And it contained a short reference, quite short reference, to the 1972 World Chess Championship between the American Bobby Fischer and the Soviet world champion Boris Vasilievich Spassky in Reykjavik, the tiny capital of the tiny state of Iceland, stuck out there in the North Atlantic. And when he mentioned it to me, and we'd been discussing what we might do next, a bell rang. This sounded like something we ought to take a look at. The most notorious chess match of all time. We started with that, and having done the book and looked at other chess matches, we think that's still true. Over 30 years later, this match, the most notorious match, chess match of all time. Why was it so notorious? So we moved from a little incident, perhaps 10, 15-minute incident, in a small room in Cambridge, a sharp discussion between two philosophers in front of about 30 people. We have moved from that to looking at a world event played out in Reykjavik over 2 months in front of the world's press. So it made quite a change for us. But Notorious, why was it that this World Chess Championship, of all World Chess Championships, and after all it had been going since 1886, why did this match for the first time take the headlines? Why did it share the front pages with Vietnam, with the dawning Watergate affair? In Britain, it drove the ferocious events of Northern Ireland in that summer off the front pages. For the first time, the BBC broadcast chess in New York. There was nearly a riot when a bar owner wanted to switch to a World Series game rather than carry reports. It made stars of chess commentators. They came out of church halls and dark chess clubs up flights of wooden stairs to become commentators and stars in their own right. Chess became the rage. It's what you talked about, your friends. People who didn't know anything about chess placed bets on the outcome of the match. Why? And were the explanations given for it then, were they right? When David and I write, we like to get to where the action was. Our process is really one of interrogating the past. Obviously, to interrogate eyewitnesses, to interrogate the documents, but we like to get along to the places themselves. In this case, we went off and sat in the hall in Reykjavik where the match was played and talked to the Icelanders who ran it. We went up to the great Keflavik US Air Base and looked at where Bobby Fischer went night after night to bowl and to eat American steaks and drink American milk and feel happy that in this one place he could be sure the Soviets weren't getting at him, sending out electromagnetic rays to poison his teeth. We went there. We went to Moscow. We sat in a former village exclusively reserved for writers and artists. In the dead winter silence of the Moscow woods, we sat and talked to Boris Spassky's second wife, Larissa, about her relationship with him, about her view of the match. She went to Reykjavik and was shocked by what she found when she got there, that the Boris who had set off for the match so full of health was now gaunt, sleepless. She thought he was being got at. A highly educated woman to this day believes that someone somehow was influencing her husband. Was it drugs? Was it hypnosis? Was it parapsychology? That something was happening to him. And joy of joys, we sat with the former Deputy Minister of Sport of the Soviet Union, Viktor Andreevich Ivonin, and I held in my hand what I think is a unique document of this match, his daily diary of the events. As sports minister, he was actually in charge of 18 sports. He was a real communist apparatchik. And I may say, like so many, he's doing pretty well today. Now the Soviet Union is over. He's deputy director of the Russian National Lottery. He has a nice big office. He has a car. He has a chauffeur. He has a bodyguard. And he has the diaries that he kept throughout his ministerial life. Handwritten. Everything that passed through his office, he wrote down at the time. There could be no better source of what the Soviets were thinking and doing and saying to each other about Bobby Fischer, about the match, about their own world champion, Boris Vasilievich. He wrote in anything that came to hand. The diaries for this match are actually written in a Soviet Trade Ministry diary he must have picked up on some visit. So, with all this interrogating the past, we stood back to look at this match, the most notorious chess match of all time, to ask about the perception of it at the time. And at the time, of course, it was notorious because, first of all, it was seen as a Cold War match. We're back in 1972. A Cold War match. And Bobby Fischer did his best to make sure that people saw it in that way. He undoubtedly saw it himself in that way. He went to Reykjavik, he said, to teach those lying, hypocritical Russians a lesson. And he believed that just as in medieval times the national leaders fought it out hand to hand, that he was like that. He was going to Reykjavik to fight it out with the Soviets hand to hand. And the press picked up this and they ran with it. It's a very curious thing because, of course, 1972 was the high point of détente. A new settlement was emerging between East and West. The skies were filled with diplomats flying to conferences to discuss strategic nuclear weapons and what they called, I remember the phrase so well, mutual and balanced force reductions. I don't think they ever got anything on that, but it was the high point of détente. Leading journals on international affairs declared the Cold War over, but not in Reykjavik. In Reykjavik, Bobby Fischer had gone to do hand-to-hand battle. So that was one reason why it was notorious. Another, of course, was the personality of Fischer himself. All those adjectives that Michael read out was how people saw him. The novelist Arthur Koestler coined a word for him. He called him a mimophant. Where his own life was concerned and his own affairs, he had all the sensitivity of a mimosa. But where other people were concerned, he had all the sensitivity of an elephant, trampling over them. The phrase control freak was not invented then, but it should have been, to be invented for Bobby Fischer and his desire for total control over all the circumstances in which the match was held. So we had to look at that side of it. And then, of course, there was the Soviet side. Boris Spasky was seen as a perfectly straightforward product of the mighty Soviet chess machine. You have to get back into the mindset of the Soviet Union, where sport was, of course, political. The whole purpose of sport was politics, not the games themselves. People did sport because it made them better communists, better Soviet citizens. It produced concentration, a sense of strategies, chess in particular. It also kept them away from drink. In the evening after a hard day on the collective farm, they would naturally have a tendency to go off and get drunk. If they were playing chess, they couldn't really do that. So there was a chess machine. you might say that it started just after the revolution. So you could imagine that they were saying to themselves, communism equals electricity plus chess. And chess was seen as exemplifying the virtues of the Soviet socialist system, and they had held the world title uninterruptedly since 1948. And that was seen as showing that the Soviet system worked. One of the contenders for the World Championship, Mark Taimanov, Fischer rolled over him 6-0. It was unparalleled. He got a real beating, Taimanov, from the Soviet chess authorities. He said there were 3 things that demonstrated the superiority of the Soviet system: the ballet, the circus, and chess. So when Boris Vasilievich went off to play in Reykjavik, he didn't go simply as a top gifted world-class chess player defending the title he had quite justifiably won in 1969. In the eyes of the Soviets, he went off to play for the Soviet Union to exemplify the success of its system and its virtues. Soviet chess players were, in the phrase that they used, expected to play in red shirts. But was this true of Boris Spassky? And the fact is, nothing could have been further from the truth. The London Times described him in the match as the usual sort of benign Soviet bureaucrat. Behind the scenes, nobody saw him like that. Behind the scenes, he was seen as, well, irritating is an understatement of a major sort. He was not a Soviet patriot, quite deliberately not. He was a Russian, old-fashioned, Slavophile Russian patriot. He did not believe in the system. He didn't play for the system. He was his own man. They found it hard to decide quite what he was. He wasn't a dissident, that was for sure, but was he a nihilist? Was he an artist? Was he a joker? There are references in interviews that were done for this book in which they talk about him as though he were that very traditional pre-Tsarist figure, the holy fool, sort of licensed jester, able to say unpalatable things and have them accepted because of the intense religiosity. But Spasskij defied the system. Had he not been so gifted, he might have had a very different sort of future indeed. So we had to look at that. And of course we had to look at the circumstances in which the match was played. Bobby Fischer's demand for total control over the circumstances of the match. Why the Soviets, why Boris Vasilievich didn't fight back on that. He could have quite easily have left Reykjavik with the title, having declined to go along with the demands made by Fischer. The Icelanders play their part in it. They're a tiny country. They invested a huge amount in the match. They invested so much they could not say no to Fischer. He played chicken with them. And they won, and he won. So all this comes in then into the match itself. The drain on Boris Spasskij's nerves and morale when Fischer fails to turn up for the opening of the match. Boris is in Iceland. His preparation has not been good. There's a lot of worry about him back in Moscow. He hasn't worked hard enough. He's played too much tennis. He hasn't taken a full team with him that he really needed. He hadn't got a manager there. He thought they'd be KGB, and he was probably right, but they might have helped him. Right. The steady drain on his morale, on his energies. Fischer does turn up, loses the first game on a blunder, a beginner's blunder. Spasskij isn't fooled by that. Fischer then forfeits the second game. Will he stay? There was a question, would he go? Now the question is, will he stay? He stays on condition he plays in a small back room. Boris Vasilievich agrees. He agrees in one word. He just says in Russian, that's fine, pожалуйста, okay. And he goes in and gets slaughtered. From then on, it looks as though he will be run over by Fischer, as Fischer has run over so many people before, steamroller his way to the title. But Spasskij holds on, he hangs in there. There's a remarkable series of 7 draws. He can't get a breakthrough, he fights. At the end, everyone thinks that Spasskij is going to get sent to the Gulag. In fact, the word goes out, he must be treated in a civilized way. He lives to fight again. The paradox is it's Fischer who disappears and forfeits his title. The Soviets think that Fischer would have made a wonderful Soviet player. You know, he's totally focused on chess, nothing else worried him. Nothing else was there for him to think about. Whereas Spasskij would have made a wonderful Western player. You know, he's full of jokes, a wonderful mimic, he likes to get around with the boys, have a good time. But it's Spasskij who comes back and fights again for the title. So it's very paradoxical. You could say, was this a Cold War match? Not for the world leaders, certainly. Not for Brezhnev, the Soviet leader at the time, not for Nixon, not for Henry Kissinger, who helped to get Fischer into the match. It was not for them a Cold War match. But in Cold War terms, there is a paradox that it was Spasskij who has the character we normally associate with the West and with democracy. Individuality, a kindness towards others. And it's Fischer who has what we've always associated with the Soviet bloc. Concerned only for himself, a total concern for himself and none with others. So this was indeed the most notorious chess match of all time. It's also the most interesting and the most paradoxical. And it's all in here. I'm available for your questions. But when you ask a question, could you go to the microphone? Yes, absolutely.
Yes, it's turned on great. I heard that after that match, Bobby Fischer had the highest rating anyone has ever had. Is that true? And has anyone ever gotten that high again?
I think that's right, and nobody has ever got this, the way in which they work out these ratings. But he certainly had it at the time. Whether he's hung on to it, I don't know. I'm ashamed to say no, but I can see a colleague in the audience. Has he? Right. But he certainly had it at the time. The man is obviously a chess genius. But he was also totally committed to chess. Even Soviet grandmasters were astonished at his commitment. It even went so far that the final dinner after the match, Fischer gets the victor's laurels, you know. And the first thing is he goes up to get the check, and he opens the envelope and reads the check several times to make sure the figures are in the right order. And then puts it in his pocket and goes and sits down again. No speech, no graceful word of thanks, no acknowledgement of his opponent, and so on and so forth. But other people make speeches. In the meantime, Fischer moves into a chair next to the exhausted Boris Spasskij, pulls out a pocket chess set, and proposes to discuss with Spasskij where he went wrong in the last game. And Don Schultz, the former chairman, president of the United States Chess Federation, told us about having dinner with Fischer, that you'd have conversation over dinner, and you'd look round and Fischer would be playing on his pocket set. They said the only problem with Fischer in chess was the necessity of having an opponent. You know, when you played these games. I'm sorry. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Is Fischer still alive?
Fischer is still alive. At least he's thought to be still alive, and he gives evidence of being alive in interviews he gives to a Philippines radio station. I don't recommend anyone to listen to them. They are long, long anti-American, anti-Semitic rants. He's not been seen for some time. After the match, as you know, he didn't defend the title in the end, and it was taken away from him in 1975. He only played once more in public after the World Chess Championship, and that was a rematch, which was done for $5 million, put up by a Yugoslav businessman, and it was played in a couple of places in Yugoslavia. At that time, the United States was operating a cultural embargo against Yugoslavia. It was during the Civil War, as part of United Nations sanctions. And as a result of playing in that match, Bobby Fischer came under indictment here in the United States, and that indictment still stands. He can't return. But nobody's seen him. We chased him through cyberspace. We got an email address for him. We sent him some emails proposing an interview. We think he's in Japan, as I say, and back came a whole series of replies, extraordinarily polite and formal replies, presumably from his intermediary. And then we had one which was different. I looked at Dave, Dave looked at me and we said, "That's Fischer." It was very direct about the conditions for the interview. And so we did our best to, the lighting, the height of the table. But we then, the next step was just another very formal reply again saying, "Mr. Fischer will not give you an interview." Boris Vasilievich, of course, lives in Paris and he's accessible. It's not easy to pin down because he's a Russian and he's always going to decide tomorrow what he's going to do. But he did talk to us and is a man of great charm and still playing a certain amount of chess.
How old was Spasskij at that match? He was about 7 or 8 years older than Fischer, I think.
Yes, but Bobby Fischer was 29.
Right.
Though curiously, all the people who worked with him referred to him as a kid. I thought it was very significant that he had New York lawyers looking after his affairs, and they talked about him as a kid. He was only a kid. He was 29 after all. And Boris Vasilievich was 35.
Repeat the question.
I'm sorry, how old was... I'm sorry, yes, you didn't make the journey to the microphone. And I forgot to ask you, apologies to our colleagues here. How old was Boris Spasskij at the time of the match? He was born in 1937 and had a very hard time just after the Second World War.
What caused him to go, you said Vietnam, I believe, is where he's currently, or he was residing?
Sorry?
Where was he residing? You said Vietnam or something?
In Japan.
In Japan.
He's thought to be in Japan. Nobody's actually seen him, I don't think, for some time. He's thought to be in Japan. He's 6'2", and you would think he would literally stand out in Japan. But nobody's actually seen him. There are always these rumors he's busy playing on the internet, but I think that's thought not to be the case. They're just people taking up his style. He says he will only play what is called random chess from now on.
What made him change? He went from like anti-Soviet to like anti-American.
That I couldn't read that into his psychology. He was very anti-Soviet from quite an early stage in his chess career, and that steadily got worse. He was also anti-Semitic from quite an early age, and that has got worse. But why he's taken against your country, the country here, I do not know, but he certainly has. And I think I was told that his picture has now been taken down from the US Chess Hall of Fame as a result of the remarks he made after 9/11.
Bobby Fischer has been known to cut off long-term relationships with any friends who were willing to talk about him to the press. Did you therefore find it difficult to find any friends of his that were willing to talk to you about Bobby Fischer?
No, we didn't have a problem. One or two called off interviews with us because they were intending to write their memoirs, and they thought their reminiscences should be for the memoirs and not for our book. But others, for instance, Paul Marshall, his New York lawyer, very willingly gave us a very complete interview on it. So, and David Levy, chess player, who stayed with Bobby Fischer after the match when Fischer was living in California, he gave us an interview. I think Robert Byrne gave us an interview. So we didn't have any problems with that. But we haven't spoken to anyone who is currently associated with Fischer. A, we don't know who they are, and B, we don't know where he is.
Did you get a chance to talk to Larry Evans, who I think may have been a second?
Yes, yes. Okay. No, he wasn't a second, but he was a second in a previous match with Fischer, and was stunned by the way in which the young Fischer devoted himself every hour of the waking day to chess, chess, nothing but chess. If you go behind the microphone, you can get in there.
I just like to introduce myself as one of the few people who has actually met the guy. I went to high school with him and actually played a game of chess with him. Because we were both freshmen. He advised me to resign after about 2 minutes. But I recall him as a gangly kind of strange kid in brown corduroy slacks and a T-shirt with a kind of very distant, spaced out look on his face, with 3 or 4 books in Russian or German or whatever on chess under his arm. He flunked geometry twice, and he left high school after his sophomore year because he wasn't given leave to be able to go out and play in the national championships, and I don't think he went back to school after that. Very strange person, and I think dismissive is another adjective that I'd add to your list.
Well, thanks for the adjective. And the memory, funnily enough, I was doing a phone-in this morning, and a caller had also been at Erasmus High at the same time as Fischer. He left as soon as he was able. He didn't see the point of being there. And I have some sympathy with him at this point, because there he is. He's already a figure on the world stage of chess, a predictive future champion. He's United States champion. He'd been in the candidates matches. And that's his chess life. And then he has to go to school and share a desk with somebody and, you know, be taught. And you think, what an unbearable strain on his personality that must have been at that time. How did he bridge the two worlds, in which, in the one world, he is seen as this truly great player with, you know, all these adults around him. They're equal and better. And in this other world, he's just a school kid.
I don't think he did. I think he just tuned out.
Yes,
Thanks.
absolutely.
I have 2 questions, if it's okay with you. The first one concerns, I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. I just got it a couple days ago for my birthday. Is there anything new or previously very little reported in the book that that you can just quickly go over? And the second one's a little bit longer question, so if you want to answer that one first, I can...
Well, yes, there is a lot new, partly because people are much freer to speak now. But the whole Soviet side is new. Nobody before, I mean, a lot of the books are written on the match. And when I went to interview the German referee, he very kindly and in a caring manner told me there were already 421 books on the match, which was very nice of him to reassure me in that way. But I think he meant it caringly. But a lot of them were written just after the match. The fact is that we have the Soviet side, the real Soviet side. What they thought about Boris, Boris's preparation, the stresses and strains in Boris's team, how he quarrelled with the 2 people he needed most for his preparation, what happened to him, how they felt about the course of the match itself, what was being said in Moscow about it, all that and more has not been seen before, and nobody before has had access to this daily diary by the Deputy Minister of Sport, who was in charge of chess. But again, the chess players in the Soviet Union, now in Russia, felt much easier about talking about it. And for instance, we have details of the KGB involvement in the match, which have never seen the light of day before. And of course we have a lot about Fischer because people felt much freer to speak, and also because the FBI file on his mother has been released. The FBI followed his mother for 30 years. They thought she was a communist sympathizer and possibly a Soviet spy. And the files are extraordinarily detailed. You can correct some details about Fischer's life in there, but also get their view of him and their insights. For instance, there's a lot that comes out of the file that is new about his first visit when he was a teenager to Moscow. And one of the reasons, perhaps, why he took against the Soviets from that age. Anyway, you've had a second question.
Yes, I did. And it's, for those of us who've played chess for a while, it's concerning the filming rights of the 72 match. Between an American named Chester Fox and the organizers of the tournament. The first game, of course, was filmed and televised in the U.S., and then dispute came out afterwards, and literally all hell broke loose. That was one of the big reasons why the second game was forfeited. In a book that was written back in 1974 or 75, the author, who was a Life magazine reporter, Brad Darish, had written about the filming of it. ABC's Wide World of Sports bought the rights, and there was one game filmed after that. But apparently Fox had an agreement with the engineer of the match, because all the games were then shown closed circuit afterwards. And reportedly there is a complete video copy of the entire match in a bank vault in Iceland. Fox went back after the match, and the engineer said, "Pay your bills," and he said no, and he never got the film. I wonder if you had found any rumor or any further information about this, because you know, it was dying. Everyone in the West was dying to see this match live and or on film, and they basically got nothing. So I was wondering if you had found any new evidence in your research about the films.
It is indeed in here, and the Icelanders negotiated with a relatively inexperienced and almost completely unknown in the film industry at large, New Yorker Chester Fox, that he had the film rights. The background to that agreement is slightly mysterious, because it emerged that Fox's name came up from Fischer's advisory team. And the Icelanders certainly suspected, or suspect today, that the agreement was not quite as straightforward as they have been led to believe. But as you said, Fischer took against the filming because he claimed that the noise of the film cameras was disturbing him. That noise was measured with a state-of-the-art audiometer by an Icelandic engineer, and he said it was totally outside the range of human hearing, that Fischer could not possibly have heard it. But Fischer took against it, and that created the original forfeit and the problems over match 3, the move into the small room. Fox was undoubtedly given the runaround. He had this agreement with the Icelanders, but they did not stand up. They could not stand up to Fischer. Fox threatened to sue. It was all smoothed over. There was obviously no point. As you say, other television organizations came in and they tried to do it. They thought they could get an agreement with Fischer, but in the end you couldn't get that agreement. The closed circuit he didn't have the rights to, and had no agreement with the Icelandic engineers who set it up. He claimed that he ought to, but because it was purely for closed circuit use inside the hall, he didn't have a claim. And every night the engineer responsible for the closed circuit climbed across the roof of the hall to get the tape of the closed circuit and to spirit it out of the hall, just in case someone else, Chester Fox, got their hands on it. Those tapes, they're terrible quality if you look at the still photographs from them. Those tapes are somewhere, but no one in Iceland is prepared to admit that they know even about the existence of the tapes, let alone where they are. But there's a treasure trove there for someone. Get to Reykjavik.
Quick question. Why did Spasskij choose to stay in Iceland after everything decided to break loose? Why not just go home?
He decided to stay in Iceland. It's commonly thought, incidentally, that the Soviet authorities rang him up and told him to leave, and he defied them. It's not true. That is certainly not true. They were in no position to tell him to leave. But he stayed because of the frame of mind in which he went. He went for a celebration of chess. In the Russian phrase, he went for a feast of chess. And that's what he thought it was going to be. He was a great admirer of Fischer and liked him. He played him 5 times before, won 3 and drawn 2. He was totally confident he could win at the board. His preparation, there's no question, his preparation was flawed. He was in charge of his own preparation, and it was not up to it. He went with quite a difficult team as well. But nonetheless, he went for this celebration of chess, and he stayed because he wanted that, and he thought he could win. And that's why he stayed. Fischer, of course, went to declare war. So you have this imbalance right away. There is Boris Spassky looking forward to a feast of chess, and there is Bobby, and he's come to declare war.
Well, I'm probably one of the few people here that has met both of them. I'm a chess player myself. I played in the same tournament with Spasskij in 1986, and I met Fischer in 1964. I think one thing I wanted to add, that Spasskij had a certain amount of courage. I'll tell a little story about him. He gave a big talk in Russia. They have these huge meetings where they give talks about chess. And he was asked a question of why Paul Keres never became world champion. Now, to explain who Paul Keres was, from Estonia. And to give an idea of his significance in chess, they used to have an elimination tournament to decide who would challenge for a world championship match. And Keres finished second in that tournament 4 times. And in answer to this question, Spasskij said in public, Keres, like his country, has not been blessed by fate. And to say that in the old Soviet Union took a lot of courage. I was wondering if you had that sort of thing about you come across that sort of things when you talked about Spasskij. The other thing I would also want to mention is, in answer to a previous question, Kasparov has surpassed Fischer's highest rating. However, Kasparov himself actually put that in a little bit of context by pointing out that Fischer was further ahead of his contemporaries than anyone ever has. And just like people say there are people who have since become the youngest grandmaster since Fischer became younger than Fischer did, but Fischer didn't just become the youngest grandmaster. He became a candidate for the world championship at 15, and no one has ever done that.
He was extraordinarily gifted.
Yeah.
I don't know if it took courage on the part of Boris Spassky to make that remark that Estonia had not had a happy fate. Incidentally, he went to Paul Keres's funeral wearing a bright red suit, taken by Soviet chess players to indicate his frivolous state of mind. He made that address, yes, there is a record of it, in a town in Kazakhstan called Shakhty, where he addressed the Lokomotiv chess club. And he said a number of things in that address. For instance, he said if he had not been a chess player, he would have been a priest. He also said he thought the Soviet chess players were extremely badly paid, and he instanced that he could go and play in Santa Monica and earn, win $5,000, but if he played for the Soviet Union, he got 500 rubles for it. It's not quite the exact figures, but something like that. The local party secretary wrote to the Central Committee, to the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, complaining about Spassky's speech and reporting that the audience, lovely old Soviet language, the audience had expressed anger and bewilderment at what the world champion had said. But what were the Soviet authorities to do about it? Okay. He was an extraordinarily gifted player. He was at the top of the tree. They were prepared to go along with him to some extent, to say, well, he's irritating, he's foolish, he's a free spirit, he's a holy fool. Had he not been so gifted, they might have taken a much more sinister approach, because these were not the only sort of times he made those sorts of remarks. He was a Russian nationalist, a Slavophile of a very old-fashioned sort, almost a Dostoevskian figure, in that his personality never really finished. But he was a joker, he was a wonderful mimic, he loved being in company. The Soviets really didn't know what to do about him, I think. But it's very interesting that everyone thought he was really going to get punished after the match. And they did make a very severe comment on him, which is in the records. And I haven't read for the book. Let me just read what was said about him in the post-mortem on the match. At the end of the post-mortem, the Soviet Deputy Minister of Sport, who's chaired the post-mortem, which Spasskij's really, people have really gone for him, makes this summing up. He says, all his requests and wishes were fulfilled. Today we can only regret that these possibilities were not exploited in full and to the end. Spasskij's words that the match was a holiday and that there must be an honest fight can be called idealism. This was not a holiday, but a fierce struggle, and it is no coincidence that Paul Marshall, Fischer's lawyer, said that victory for Fischer was a question of national and personal pride. Unfortunately, Comrade Spasskij did not make such declarations. But the word had gone out from the Central Committee that he was to be treated in a civilized manner. And he had a 9-month ban from travelling abroad, but he lived to fight another day. And you will know, the chess players in the audience will know, that he survived to get back into the candidates round of the World Chess Championship. And indeed, he got a lot of support from the Soviet Union when he played the true distant and defector Viktor Korchnoi in a World Chess Championship match. And Spasskij at that point was living in Paris, but he still got a lot of support from the Soviets. So it's a very mixed picture. But had he been a writer, there's no question that he would have been offered compulsory psychiatric help, or maybe sent to wheel frozen dung out in Siberia.
Okay, I have to actually step in and be the bad guy now. I'd like to thank...
John Idenow is author of Bobby Fischer Goes to War. It's published by Echo, an imprint of HarperCollins. On the web at...
Incident at the heart of Wittgenstein's poker, this very, very sharp, fierce interchange between Ludwig Wittgenstein and Karl Popper, and the question whether Karl Popper had lied in his autobiography about that incident. The book is a detective story. Did he lie? But I saw some correspondence about it in the Times Literary Supplement, a leading British journal, literary journal, weekly. And I cut it out and sent them. I cut out the letters and sent them to David to amuse him. And out of that came our book, Wittgenstein's Poker, which we were very happy, surprised and happy that it had the success it had. So the question then arose of another book. We had got on writing the first one together. It's been enormous fun, very demanding. It was like having a long conversation with somebody over 2.5 years that we wrote the book. This long conversation had gone on extremely enjoyably. And we had written Wittgenstein's Poker. So what next? And David was, who still works for the BBC, was doing a series on the World Chess Championship. And it contained a short reference, quite short reference, to the 1972 World Chess Championship between the American Bobby Fischer and the Soviet world champion Boris Vasilievich in Reykjavik, the tiny capital of the tiny state of Iceland, stuck out there in the North Atlantic. And when he mentioned it to me, and we'd been discussing what we might do next, a bell rang. This sound
1972, when reigning world chess champion Boris Spasskij of the Soviet Union met American challenger Bobby Fischer in Iceland. In Bobby Fischer Goes to War, BBC journalist John Idenow details the match and its high-stakes geopolitical context. The program's 45 minutes.
I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, who, well, I'll leave it up to your judgment as to which adjectives you would like to apply. The author of the bestseller Wittgenstein's Poker and tonight's book, Bobby Fischer Goes to War, John Idenow.
Well, Michael, thank you for that. And thanks for inviting me to the store to talk about our book. I'm very happy that you read Wittgenstein's Poker in 2 sittings. I only wonder what took you so long. But like to start with Wittgenstein's poker, as you've mentioned it, and perhaps just say how that came about, and then how we managed to get in from writing about a quarrel, a sharp interchange between two leading philosophers, to a chess match between two leading chess players. And how did David and I get to write together at all? I used to present programs for the BBC, and in particular for the BBC World Service. And among the programs I presented was one about British politics. It was a regular weekly roundup of British politics. It sounded like something we ought to take a look at. The most notorious chess match of all time. We started with that, and having done the book and looked at other chess matches, we think that's still true. Over 30 years later, this match, the most notorious match, chess match of all time. Why was it so notorious? So we moved from a little incident, perhaps 10, 15-minute incident, in a small room in Cambridge, a sharp discussion between two philosophers in front of about 30 people. We have moved from that to looking at a world event played out in Reykjavik over 2 months in front of the world's press. So it made quite a change for us. But notorious, why was it that this World Chess Championship, of all World Chess Championships, and after all it had been going since 1886, why did this match for the first time take the headlines? Why did it share the front pages with Vietnam, with the dawning Watergate affair? In Britain it drove the ferocious events of Northern Ireland in that summer off the front pages. For the first time the BBC broadcast chess in New York. There was nearly a riot when a bar owner wanted to switch to a World Series game rather than carry reports. It made stars of chess commentators. They came out of church halls and dark chess clubs up flights of wooden stairs to become commentators and stars in their own right. Chess became the rage. It's what you talked about, your friends. People who didn't know anything about chess placed bets on the outcome of the match. Why? And were the explanations given for it then, were they right? When David and I write, we like to get to where the action was. Our process is really one of interrogating the past. Obviously, to interrogate eyewitnesses, to interrogate the documents, but we like to get along to the places themselves. In this case, we went off and sat in the hall in Reykjavik where the match was played and talked to the Icelanders who ran it. We went up to the great Keflavik US Air Base and looked at where Bobby Fischer went night after night to bowl and to eat American steaks and drink American milk and feel happy that in this one place he could be sure the Soviets weren't getting at him, sending out electromagnetic rays to poison his teeth. We went there. We went to Moscow. We sat in a former village exclusively reserved for, called People and Politics. And I presented it over the years, and producers came and went, and I presented the program. And one of the producers who came, I was very happy to say, and sorry when he went, one of the producers who came was David Evans. And we were riding a train down to a seaside resort one summer in the course of doing our program together to one of the British political party conferences. And I did what a lot of BBC people do to make conversation. I talked about something I'd heard on the BBC that morning. And what I'd heard was a news report about the Pope visiting Ghana. And the news report had said that this was the first time a reigning Pope had visited Ghana. And I said to David, in my sub-editor's way, I thought the word reigning was redundant because there was no such thing as a non-reigning Pope. It's an office held until death. And we got into a conversation about this. Around us were these amazed delegates going to their party conference, listening to this conversation about reigning Pope. In the course of that, I learnt that David had studied Wittgenstein at Oxford, where he was. And so later, I won't go into remains that argument, but later I saw some correspondence about the